tonight we bring you a story that has the makings of a Daniel Silva spy novel, complete with a secret break-in and plenty of international intrigue. All right, here's the question that we hope to answer. Did the CIA send a team of rogue robbers into a foreign embassy on sovereign land? Did they do so under the guise of making it look like it was going to be a bungled robbery a la Watergate? This afternoon, intelligence officers in Madrid, Spain, are saying 10 attackers broke into the North Korean embassy there just last month. They say that they have reason to suspect that at least 2 of the robbers were CIA spies. Police report that the thieves, in quotations, made off with computers and other electronic devices. This case is being investigated by both the Capitol Police and the CNI, which is Spain's National Intelligence Center. How do we know all of this? Well, we have been in contact with reporters at El País. It translates to essentially The Nation, which is one of Spain's principal newspapers. Joining us now, RT correspondent Michelle Greenstein, who's been working on this story to put it together for us. Michelle, take us through what's going on with this story and this alleged CIA involvement.
Sure. So the North Korean embassy was raided February 22nd. It was a Friday. This, as you know, was shortly before the summit between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un in Hanoi. Now, 10 masked men broke into the embassy mid-afternoon. They bound and gagged the staff. They interrogated them, and they stole phones and computers, like you said. One woman was able to escape, reportedly by climbing out a window. She left. She was screaming in Korean, which, of course, prompted residents to call the police. Now, officers knocked on the door to investigate, but they were greeted by a man who opened the door and told them everything was fine. Shortly after, 2 cars left the compound at high speed, one of them reportedly actually carrying that man who opened the door.
All right, great. That sounds like a robbery of any building, even though I guess it's more interesting because it's an embassy. But the bottom line is, was the CIA involved? We're being told 2 of the robbers had CIA connections or were actual CIA agents. What have you been able to find out about this?
Yes, so according to the Spanish police and investigators from Spain's National Intelligence Center, yes, the CIA was involved. They have linked this attack to the CIA. Now, according to El País, the Spanish paper that you mentioned, they reported that these investigators have ruled out that this was a simple robbery by what they call common criminals. Although the CIA has, of course, denied involvement, the Spanish government is telling El País that the CIA story is, quote unquote, unconvincing. They say that this attack was, quote, perfectly planned as though it were carried out by a military cell, end quote. And Rick, like I mentioned, they took computers, they took mobile phones. These devices undoubtedly had information that foreign intelligence services would love to have.
You know what's interesting? The CIA is probably one of the most important, if not one of the most powerful agencies of its type in the history of the world,
Surely.
Right? So here you have this, I imagine, right? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you have this little police department in Madrid, you know, local cops, essentially making allegations against said organizations. You do also have the CNI, which is the CIA equivalent in Spain. One wonders in the end, given this mixture or this bizarre alignment of agencies, who will be able to stand up to the CIA and say, no, you were involved and we're not backing off our statement?
Right. Well, it's important to remember that the Spanish police and investigators from Spain's National Intel Center, they're the ones actually alleging that the CIA is involved. So at this point, it doesn't look like the CNI, Spain's intelligence, and the CIA are coordinating with each other. Although the CIA is definitely in coordination with the South Korean intelligence. And actually, El País, that Spanish paper, is suggesting that this attack was probably carried out by the CIA and South Korean intelligence in coordination with one another.
Which would make sense that the South Koreans would be in cahoots with the United States to try and gather as much information as they possibly can on the North Koreans. The question is, how do you do it, right?
Right.
And whether we broke the law in doing so.
Right, and the South Korean intelligence agency has actually come forward and admitted to trying to rig South Korean elections in favor of more right-wing, hawkish candidates that do not support a unified Korea. So it would make sense. But let me tell you what we know about the robbers. Security cameras in the area were actually identifying some of the assailants. So most of them were Korean. At least two of them, like you said, were recognized by Spanish intel for their links with the CIA. According to El País, here's what's really interesting. The head of the operation, who called himself the entrepreneur, actually separated one diplomat from the rest of the staff, from the rest of the hostages, and locked himself alone in a room with him. This is the current head of the Pyongyang delegation to Madrid, who actually knows a lot about another figure named Kim Hyok-chol. This is the former ambassador, the former North Korean ambassador to Spain, who was more recently reassigned as the point man for nuclear negotiations with the U.S. So it's possible that this was just intended to intimidate the DPRK, but Spanish services are saying they think that the sole point of this attack, of this raid, was to get information on Kim Hyok-chol.
Michelle Greenstein, thank you so much for that report. Fascinating. Absolutely. I'm Rick Sanchez. You found us on YouTube, and that's awesome. But you know what? I'm also live every night at 7 and 8 p.m. Eastern on DirecTV and Dish and cable and satellite, the RT app, and Pluto TV. I'll see you there. All the talk of how our economy has been on a consistent upswing for going on, 9 consecutive years now, with GDP numbers, unemployment numbers, housing numbers, all generally in an upward direction, or at least stable. There's one number that scares the hell out of economists because it's frighteningly high. And if we hit a recession, heaven knows how this number, this alarmingly huge number, is going to be reconciled. The number that I'm referring to is the corporate debt. America's corporate debt. See, corporate debt is the amount of money that corporations have been borrowing over the past 9 years. While borrowing has been so super cheap, it's been easy. It's nothing short of extraordinary where it is. And you want to know what that number stands at right now? $9 trillion. $9 trillion. I know you've heard people complain about our national debt, right? It's way too high as well. It's $21 trillion. But that's the public debt. That means our corporate debt, the private debt, is almost half of that. What were to happen if we were to suddenly hit a recession? You may not want to know. Richard Wolff is a professor of economics who is keenly aware of what could happen if our debt bubble does, in fact, burst. He joined me earlier this week from our Capitol studios. There's 2 areas we can go to, 3 really, if you include student loan debt, which seems to be somewhere around $2 trillion. The corporate debt in this country, which Richard will explain to you, which is about $9 trillion. And then our national debt, which is more of a public debt, which is around $21 trillion. Now, I know those numbers are huge and it's hard to kind of put them into perspective. So let's take them one at a time. Let's start with corporate debt. $9 trillion in corporate debt. How do we get there? What is it? And how much danger exists for us as a country with that big number?
Well, let's start with how it happened. You have to go back at least to 2008 and the crash of the American economy, the crash really of global capitalism. So frightened were the people who run the United States at that time the big bankers in New York, the politicians at the Federal Reserve, and so on, that they rushed in to try to hold the economy from a complete collapse. And one of the things they did was drop interest rates to historically unprecedented lows. Not only all the way to zero, but on and off below zero. Negative interest rates, which we hadn't seen hardly ever in our history. What this did made credit virtually free. And every corporation having any kind of difficulty over the last 10 years, and that's almost all of them, solved their problem by borrowing essentially free money. It was an opportunity none of them could forego. It was too delicious. It was a way to solve their problem that was easier, since the interest rates were next to nothing, than anything else they could have done. So they loaded up on debt. And now the problem is they're going to have a hard time in the years ahead making the kind of money they need to make to begin to pay off that debt, because especially now as interest rates are starting to go up, they're going to have a heavy load to solve in this way, and they're not prepared for it. And we have to remember.
And by the way, I just got to say, there's nothing wrong with borrowing money to start a company. It's part of the American story, right? You and Richard and Rick get together. Hey, let's start a restaurant around the corner. We don't have enough money. My uncle will give us some money, but we have to borrow the rest. That's fine. The problem, it seems to me, tell me if I'm wrong, is that's been flipped. It used to be you'd borrow 60%, you'd come up with 60% of the money, maybe borrow 40%, maybe 30%. But now it's the other way around. Companies are being built on like 80% debt, and they're only putting in 20% cash. That doesn't seem right.
Absolutely. Let me give you a simple example. They borrowed over the last 10 years, for example, huge amounts of money to go into the stock market and buy the shares of their own company. It's called a share buyback. Why would they do that? That doesn't increase their capacity to produce anything. It just reduces the number of shares. But here's the reason. When they go in and buy their own shares, they drive up the value of the shares. And many of the corporate executives doing that have pay packages linked to the price of the shares in the market. So this was a simple way to borrow money at no cost and boost their own pay packages, which went off the grid over the last 10 years. Another thing they did was to buy each other, mergers and acquisitions. Again, that doesn't change the productivity of our society. It's just a manipulation among corporations made possible and cheap by all this free credit given out by the government. So yeah, it has buried us in a corporate debt problem. We've never had this before at this scale. And if an economic downturn comes, as most economists expect over the next 12 to 24 months, nobody can guess what will happen when the companies that go down can't pay back the debts they've taken out, and how that will spread the misery across our economy. Very scary proposition.
Let me end with this number that I just found, and I think it's correct. I got it as I was researching this segment and this interview that I was about to do. It says that right now our banking or corporate cash to debt ratio in the United States as of the end of 2018 was at 12%. I'm not an economist or a financier, but that number troubles me as an American. Should it?
Absolutely. It tells you that if bad economic times come, and again, the majority of economists expect that over the next 12 to 14 months, an economic downturn. It tells you that for every dollar of debt that's going to come due, the cash that is held in the hands of the borrower is 12 cents, and that doesn't begin to cover it. So you could have a classic modern version of what we used to call a run on the banks, or a bank panic, or a monetary panic. And let's not forget, What led to the crisis of 2008 was the inability of people who couldn't afford it to pay back the mortgages they had taken out, and then the system fell apart based on that failure of the debt to be repayable.
I think even I understand it. If we get into a very difficult situation and you got there because you overborrowed, there isn't any place to go to borrow to fix the original borrow. So it's almost like a real catch-22 that we can find ourselves in. Richard Wolff, as usual. Go ahead, you were going to finish?
No, I just want to say that it is a very dangerous place we've come into, and that's why all this talk of recovery hides the fact that the things we did to look like we were recovering created a greater vulnerability than what we had in the first place.
Well said. Richard Wolff, as usual. That's why we like having you on. You tell it like it is. Thank you, my friend, for taking time to join us.
Glad to be here, Rick.
I'm Rick Sanchez. You found us on YouTube, and that's awesome. But you know what? I'm also live every night at 7 and 8 p.m. Eastern on DirecTV and Dish and cable and satellite, the RT app, and Pluto TV. I'll see you there. And from the national headquarters of RT America in our nation's capital, hello again, everybody. I'm Rick Sanchez. We begin tonight with a new report released by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which says that more than 7 million Americans cannot pay off their car loans. They are delinquent, which means they are behind on their payments by at least 90 days, 3 months. This is a surprising revelation. And you probably are asking, how can that be, right? Especially considering all the reports that we've been getting. This economy is booming, right? And the labor market way up, according to all the reports that we've been seeing. Is this the proverbial canary in the coal mine story? Mainstream economists did not see this coming. And then again, they also don't talk very much to mainstream economists about something like this. Did you know that the debt-wise, in terms of debt, the average American has never really recovered from the 2008 meltdown? That's important. Why? Well, because the Fed, according to critics, printed money out of thin air and kept interest rates at zero for about 10 years. The part about zero for 10 years is not according to critics, that's a fact. So what did Americans do? They pulled out the old credit card and they started borrowing, and they started borrowing, and they started borrowing over the last 10 years. So much so that we've now amassed $15.2 trillion in household debt. So yes, the economy has gotten better, but we haven't paid down much of what we've borrowed. In fact, we've actually borrowed more. Why? We had no incentive to pay it down. Why? Because the Fed kept interest rates pushed down so low, and by keeping them there, it actually encouraged most Americans to go out and get more stuff, even if it's stuff they didn't really need. So what happens if there's a downturn now? See, this is the kind of smart conversation we want to have with people. The projections are worrisome, and we're going to drill down on this phenomenon with an economist who kind of saw this coming. That's here on the News with Rick Sanchez, where we believe in looking at what got us to where we are, because it is time to do news again. Okay, let's get started with 3 important points that I need to share with you regarding what I just told you about this report that 7 million Americans can't pay their car loans. 1, most of the people who can't pay their car loans, they're either under the age of 30 or they are subprime borrowers. Does that sound familiar? Subprime borrowers. That means they kind of didn't have the credit to buy whatever it is they were sold. Here's another important point. The report reflects the last quarter of 2018, so it's the last part of last year when we suddenly learned about this. So here are the questions that we need to ask. Given these conditions, what happens if we get hit by another recession? Who's going to pay off the debt that average Americans have assumed while they get laid off, or maybe their pay continues to be cut back? Oh, and as the middle-class taxpayers are now finding out, the Trump tax rebate, the one they got last year, that was a one-time deal. So now what? Richard Wolff is a professor of economics at UMass Amherst, also co-founder of Democracy at Work. We talk about what happens to the average American if we do get hit by a recession.
They're going to be in a situation where the debt does not go down when the rest of the economy does. If you lose your job, or you have to switch to a job that pays you less, or someone in your family does, your debts don't go down to accommodate your reduced economic situation. I mean, with these automobile loans, you also have to remember that for millions, for most Americans, public transportation being what it is in this country, the automobile is their way to shop, is their way to get to and from work, is really their lifeline. So that the ramifications of losing your car, because if you're back 3 months, you're going to start seeing repossessions of cars on a massive scale, you're going to see a kind of a mushroom effect, a snowball effect, in which the bad economic downturn gets worse and worse almost of its own accord, because you've set this process in motion.